All right, so this is a supplemental video, should be pretty short. And this is going to be focused on parts of speech. So in English 1, I talk about certain parts of speech in kind of a limited sense, and a couple of the exams are elaborating on the parts of speech that they use. So really what we've been talking about is the noun and the verb, specifically the subject and the verb. So you've seen that stuff. And the thing that I discussed in English 1, and I'll kind of scroll down to the examples so that we can look at it, was this type of situation. So the big focus that I put in English 1 was understanding that if there is a dependent clause or a transitional phrase at the beginning of a sentence, that moves the subject and verb to the independent part of the sentence. So you can't have your subject or your verb in a transitional type phrase like the one that's here, when I was in high school. So if you've put together everything that we've talked about in English, we've actually said in several different places and in several different ways that these phrases kind of get disregarded. So if you're doing subject-verb agreement from English 3, you would disregard that because just for the same reason, the subject and the verb are in the second half of the sentence. They can't be in the transitional half. So that affects not only identifying the subject and identifying the verb, it also affects subject-verb agreement because it affects where you go to look for your subject and to see if your subject matches up with your verb. Another thing that we talked about in English 1 is that having one of those transitional sentences in place can have a pretty tremendous effect on what the subject actually is or looks like. And again, this example, and you're absolutely welcome to go back to English 1 to see the full discussion of this because I'm really just introducing something else here. In this case, running actually ends up being the subject. The sentence here is about running. And so running, even though you would glance at that and think, oh, that's a verb, it's actually a subject in this particular case, and the verb is actually the word was. I also elaborate a little bit in saying was, is, were, you know, have. Some of most of the verbs that you should expect to see, I guess, are not the verbs you think of. You could certainly identify a verb in a sentence, and that verb could be running, walking, wondering, something that would be a bigger, more obvious action word that would draw your attention to it. More often than not, the verb in a sentence is what we would refer to as a state of being word, which would be like was, is, have. So usually, more often than not, maybe not usually, but more often than not, your verb is going to kind of hide because it's going to be a state of being. So when you read a sentence, you should always think, what is the sentence about? What is the sentence focused on as far as who typically is the pronoun? And then what is the verb? What is the actual action that is happening with that subject? Because every sentence has a subject, which is usually a person, but it could be a person, place, or thing. And then that subject is doing one primary thing. And I say one primary instead of just saying that the subject is doing something, because in some instances you might actually see the presence of more than one noun, but not more than one subject. And you might see the presence of more than one verb. The thing I want to talk about in this class, this is really aimed at people taking the CAP exam, but the TEAS is actually currently kind of copying the CAP in putting more of this on there. So going backward a little bit in your packet, when I gave you this in English 1, and this first 2 pages you have from English 1, I actually did define all 4 of the parts of speech, and I did talk very, very briefly about them in English 1. What we're going to focus on in this class is those second 2 that we really didn't put a lot of emphasis on. How do we identify an adverb and how do we identify an adjective? So an adverb and an adjective have one big thing in common, which is that they are modifying words. They don't have to be there. the subject and the verb that's the primary verb that the subject is doing, those have to be there. You could put adverbs all over the place in a sentence, or you could put no adverbs in a sentence at all. And same thing with adjectives. So what the adjective does, this is the second one, adjective, is it modifies the noun. So for example, if the subject is one of these things, so let's say that the subject is girl, you could say pretty girl, or you could say tired girl. You could describe her in any way that you wanted to, and that would be an adjective because you are describing, you're using a descriptive word for the noun. Does not have to be the subject for that. You can use adjectives with the subject, and you can use adjectives with other nouns that are also in the sentence. And you'll be asked to identify those interchangeably. So it's not like it has to be the one that's functioning as a subject in order to have an adjective. Again, same thing with, let's say, Mrs. Smith is the subject of the sentence. We might say the experienced Mrs. Smith or something like that. So an adjective is going to modify a noun. When they ask you to identify an adjective, the most important thing you can start by doing is finding the nouns. So when we're going to identify an adjective, we are going to find the noun. With an adverb, we have the same situation, except an adverb is going to be something that describes the verb. And you'll notice they both have ad. Adverb is easy to remember because it's got verb in the sentence. And so an adverb is going to essentially explain or describe the action. So an adjective describes the noun or the subject. The adverb describes the action. And again, so your key first step, if you're finding an adjective, is to find the noun. And your key first step to find an adverb is to find the verb. In both cases, it does not have to be the subject or the primary verb to have an adverb or an adjective. You could have an adjective with 5 different nouns in the same sentence, or you could have an adverb with 5 different verbs that are in the same sentence. You can have it with the primary one that you identify as the subject or the verb for that subject, or that could actually be missing, and it could be with a different noun or a different verb. So it really just depends on the sentence. You will be asked to identify specific instances. Some questions will actually have you identify a couple of different adverbs or adjectives. Some will have you just identify one, and you may or may not be ignoring the fact that there are others. So an adverb would describe how an action is happening. So let's look at a couple of verbs that we might use. So like run, you could run fast. And then that would be describing how you run. So an adjective is describing something more about the noun, and an adverb is describing more about the verb. And typically, when you're describing more about the verb, it's how the verb is happening. Running fast, walking slow. And that would be, you know, not a guarantee, but something you can definitely count on. Oftentimes, it's going to be a how kind of situation. So essentially, the focus of this supplement is just being able to recognize adverbs and being able to recognize adjectives when you are in a sentence. I have attached a few pages worth of practice on this. Some of these questions are harder than others. I will definitely tell you that for the most part, you're going to find that they're fairly easy when you do see them on the test. So I guess what I'm saying is if you do well with the hard ones, you are more than fine with the easy ones. And the easy ones are what you're going to probably see more of. I'm going to do random ones of these that point out different things, but ultimately I'm going to leave most of this practice for you so that you can get a little bit used to looking for an adverb or looking for a verb. There's also questions in here about what the subject is. That's going to be really important practice if you did not do English 3, and a lot of you don't. A lot of my students do not do English 3. because it is a pretty hard class. I'm saying that right now on October 7th of 2018. In the future, the curriculum will be redesigned and redesigned again and redesigned again. By the time you're hearing it is possible that there is no English 3, or it's possible that English 3 is a more common class. At the moment, English 3 is just subject-verb agreement, which I kind of view as usually being too difficult to really play with while you're trying to do all these other things to get ready for your test. The exception to that is HESI. HESI puts a lot of subject-verb agreement. TEAS, CAP, and PACS, as it stands now, do not put a lot of subject-verb agreement. Instead, they may ask you to get good at identifying a subject, or they may ask you to identify an adverb or an adjective, which is the point of this supplement. So the first question, number 1, is one of the ones I'm going to do. And this says, which noun in the sentence below is the subject? Every sentence has a subject. There can only be one subject. The subject is what the sentence is about, and the subject is who is doing or what is doing the verb that goes with it. Identifying the subject and the verb very early on is helpful. I tell you to do that if you did do subject-verb agreement with me. The key to figuring out if they agree, needless to say, is figuring out what they are. So in this case, you have a couple of different names in here, and that's going to be very typical of questions that ask you to identify the subject. They're always going to give you a sentence that has 2 or 3 different nouns that are pronouns that could function as the subject. So you want to look at the sentence and what is the sentence actually trying to achieve. So in this case, it says the night nurse had to call Dr. Leon to let him know that his patients had been waiting for him for over an hour. Dr. Leon is tempting. You got capital letters there. It looks like the ultimate pronoun. It looks like it's a subject. Dr. Leon is not the subject. He is an object in the sentence. The subject is the person who's taking the action. The action is calling, and that is the night nurse. So the subject of this sentence is that night nurse. Now, as a side note, night is not a noun. Nurse is a noun. Nurse is a person, place, or thing. Nurse is actually a thing unless you name them. So when you say, here's what the subject is, you're just going to say nurse. You're not going to say night nurse. Night is functioning as an adjective. Night is describing what type of nurse. So it is describing the noun, which is the definition of an adjective. So in this case, the sentence focuses on the nurse, not Dr. Leon. Dr. Leon happens to be who the nurse calls, but he is the object of the verb. He's the one who's going to get called, not the one who is making the call. I'm also going to do number 3, so I'll just kind of be skipping around here to give you the best examples. Number 3 says, which noun is the subject? Again, number 3 has something that we have talked about already, which is what happens when the first part of the sentence is an introductory transition type of thing. Taking charge of the situation, comma. This is irrelevant to our sentence. It's irrelevant to our subject and our verb. It's just like that example that we've looked at previously where it says, where is it at? There it is. When I was in high school, we don't care about that. This is the actual sentence. So same thing in this case. The actual sentence is Dr. Clemens immediately dispatched Sheila and me to the intensive care unit. So the subject is who's taking the primary action in the sentence, and it's who the sentence is about, and that's going to be Dr. Clemens. So those are a couple of examples of correctly identifying the subject. I am going to do number 4 because number 4 is kind of unique. So it says, read the sentence below. Which pronoun should be used to replace the victims? They've got it italicized so that you know exactly what you're replacing in the second part of the sentence. Common question type. At the beginning of a sentence, they'll say the victims, and then at the second part of the sentence, they'll say the victims again. And if you read the whole sentence, it's super awkward when they refer to someone by name twice that fast, or they refer to them by a description that's identical twice. So the accident victims all arrived at the emergency ward at the same time, and the victims were treated in order according to degree of injury. So we don't want to say the victims twice. Their question is, what can we replace the victims with here to make our sentence smoother? The victims is a plural word. So there is more than one victim. They are human victims. And so it's going to be, and I actually used the word in the sentence that I just said they are human victims. It's going to be they. So when you have plural people and they're not in one group, you're referring to them as more than one person, like victims, that's going to be a they. Had they said, just as a stretching of your thought process, the group of victims, if you took subject-verb agreement, you're going to know what I'm getting at. If you didn't, you might be a little bit confused by this. The group is it. So if you refer to something as the, which is a singular word, group, everything you refer to is just the group as a whole, and we're using that as one individual thing. So the group of victims would be it as a group, and you wouldn't be able to do this in the second half of the sentence because it is a group that you would be specifying. So then you could not use they. In this case, they are saying victims both times. They're intentionally being plural. Let's see, on the next page, I'm going to go to number 6. Number 6 is another different type of question. It says, read the sentence below. There is an error with the first verb. Which answer corrects that error? So we need to find the first verb. Even though the prescription drugs were ordering. So this is the first place that we see an action. Even though the prescription drugs were ordering this afternoon, the patient is already complaining about the delay. So that's going to be were ordered because this afternoon is in the past and the patient is complaining even though the order has been placed already. So even though the prescription drugs were ordered this afternoon, let's see, I'm going to do... And the were, just as a side note, the reason I'm going with were as opposed to was is this is a situation where they would be the noun because it's prescription drugs with a plural. So if you referred to these again later in the sentence, just like the question we just did, you'd refer to them as they because it's prescription drugs and it's plural and there's more than one. And we're not referring to it as a group of drugs. We're referring to it as drugs. Let's see. I'm going to go to 8, where we are going to identify an adjective. So which word in the following sentence is an adjective? They're not saying the adjective. They're saying that this is going to be one example of an adjective. Calling frantically for some assistance, the distraught mother scanned the room for a nurse or doctor. So again, this is an introductory transition phrase. Realizing that and getting rid of it will really help you narrow down your space. The distraught mother. So who is the subject of the sentence, or at the very least, what is the noun? So mother would be a noun. That's a person, place, or thing. And so would room, and so would nurse or doctor. So there's a few different things that are nouns. This is most definitely the subject. This is the only one that has a descriptor in front of it that's telling us more about the noun. So distraught mother describes what the mother is like. Distraught describes a noun. It further describes mother, which is the noun as well as the subject. And an adjective is something that describes a noun. There is not an adjective with the other nouns. So it doesn't tell us what type of room it was, and it doesn't tell us what kind of nurse or doctor. They could have said like scanned the big room, and that would function as another adjective because then they're calling the room big. They also could have said searched for a professional nurse or doctor searched for and experienced. You could say a lot of things there where you modified your description of nurse or doctor. They didn't do that. They won't if they ask you to identify an adjective because it's harder for them to write their answers. So they'll always do that when there's just one. The next question, number 9, I'll also do. This asks us to describe the adjectives. This one's going to have more than one, and each of the answers has more than one in it. So it says, which 2 words are adjectives? And again, we want to look at, can we zone our sentence down? And we can. While the electrical power went out unexpectedly, that's irrelevant. Our sentence begins right there where we're not in a transition phrase. The hospital had to depend entirely on the unreliable generator. And so actually, you know what? Let me check here. Actually, this is going to be one instance where we don't want to get rid of that transition phrase. I'll explain why. They want 2 different adjectives. Normally, we ignore this, but there could just as easily be an adjective in an introductory sentence as there could be in the real part of the sentence. The reason I realized that you could also do, you could have been like, oh, forget about that. But then you'll notice that there's not 2 adjectives in this part of the sentence. There's only one. And that would be the unreliable generator describes something more about the generator. The generator is definitely a noun. It's a person, place, or thing. What I did there was I habitually got rid of that introductory sentence, went through the rest of the sentence. I did find an adverb, and then I found an adjective. The adverb is entirely, because depend is a verb, and then to depend entirely describes how you depend. So that was an adverb, but they only wanted adjectives. Then I found that they described the generator as unreliable. That's definitely an adjective. That would be the second adjective. That narrows your choices down tremendously. They don't have unreliable, which we know has to be the second half of the answer, in any more than one place. That said, you want to make sure that the other one that they have with it is also an adjective and is valid. And electrical power. So the power is the noun. Remember that the noun is the one that would have to be there, and the adjective is the one that could be there or not. So you could have said, while the power went out unexpectedly, power is a noun. And then electrical further describes power. You really don't have to say the word electrical, but that describes what type of power and gives you more information about the power. All of the others are not both adjectives. If you look at B, they have the word out. That is a verb. And then they have unexpectedly, which is not next to a noun, and it's not next to a verb. So even though it is a descriptive word, it's not an adjective or an adverb. C is depend, and then entirely, again, depend is a verb. Entirely is an adverb. So if you got your adverb and adjective mixed up, you might have thought entirely would work. That is describing an action. It's describing depend, which is an action. Power and generator are quite literally the nouns that we wind up modifying, but they're not the adjectives. They're the words that are accompanied by an adjective, but they are not the adjectives. Let me find one example where they have us find an adverb, and that will end the supplement. The rest will be you. Let's see. Let's do 11 because then we get to do 2 adverbs. So here's 11 over here. Which 2 words in the following sentence are adverb? Adverb further describes an action. I instantly see a verb right here. Bleeding is an active verb. And then I also see concern was maintaining her blood pressure. So I also see that maintaining blood pressure has a modifier. And immediate also has a modifier. So you've got most immediate, you've got bleeding heavily, and you've got maintaining blood pressure. Bleeding heavily, the heavily describes how the bleeding is happening and adds to that description, the bleeding being a verb. Most immediate, so most describes immediate. Immediate is the type of concern, so this is also acting as an adverb. Bleeding heavily, heavily is an adverb. Most immediate is also an adverb. And then maintaining her blood pressure could arguably be thought of as an adjective because that's describing what we are maintaining. That one they wouldn't ask you about because it kind of sits on the line of being a modifier versus being imperative in the sentence. So they wouldn't ask you for one like this. But I highly recommend, for the sake of your practice, that you look at every part of the sentence, see if you can identify the subject and the verb, see if you can identify adverbs, adjectives, whatever you can find. Identify any of that. And then when you look at the answers, make sure you always read all of the answers, because even if you're a little bit fuzzy on one of them, the others will usually make it very obvious that the answer is what you instinctively think it is. Patient is a noun, and concern is being used as a noun. Bleeding and maintaining are the active verbs as opposed to being the adverbs. Hour and pressure are most definitely not modifying verbs in the sentence. So that will help you decide, yes, it is heavily and most. Those are the only ones that can be argued as describing a verb. So you can do a lot to help yourself even on the hardest instances of these just by analyzing your sentence and analyzing your answers. This is not a huge practice packet. It's got enough for you to kind of get used to the whole adverb adjective thing, but I highly recommend really using each sentence to find everything that you can and making as much out of each example as you possibly can. You can always send me pictures of it and say, do I have my verbs and subjects and adverbs and adjectives labeled correctly? Since you're only going to get validation on the one thing that they ask about per sentence, I can validate whether you have those correct or not. You only need to send that to me and go to that trouble if you're really concerned about it or you don't feel like you're doing well with it. If you're usually getting them right when you're keying it, and you're usually having a relatively easy time finding what you need to find, you don't need to do that. It's just extra heartache for you. Hopefully I will find some other great practice like this eventually and tag it to the end. For now, this is the only practice I have that is good enough. I didn't write this because I don't have the time at the moment to write a full supplement. But hopefully I will put more and more and more practice over time. So if you're hearing this in the year 2020, by then, I've probably put all kinds of things in here. If you're hearing this in 2018, especially October, this is the practice that I can be sure will help you now. So just get the most out of the practice that you possibly can. That is it for this supplement. Let me know if you have specific questions or run into issues. Use these to get as much as you can and really get practice done. And if you feel the need, send me what you have to make sure that you are good. And that is it. I will see you later.